Good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you for joining us. We're waiting for for people who are coming and coming. And good morning to everyone who is joining us via online stream. We are starting session 3 of the conference on the topic documenting crimes of violence and rape in Ukraine. And my name is Oksana Shur. I am curator of Ukrainian Activist Nest program at Araminta NGO here in Berlin. And I am proud to have such international panelists here who will describe the topic from different perspectives. Let me introduce first participants who are here on the same stage with me offline. Okay, is it okay now? Yeah, thank you. Dr. Anna Wylegała from Warsaw, Poland, who will do the report on the topic how many times were you raped, about ethical and methodological challenges of the ongoing war documentation. Anna is a sociologist and assistant professor at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at Polish Academy of Sciences. She's author of many books on the topic in historical perspective, and her work focuses on the individual and collective memory in Poland and Ukraine, and also on the social history of the Second World War and the immediate post-war period in Polish and Ukrainian Galicia. Currently, Anna is the coordinator of the Polish part of the project Testimonies from the War, which is focused on the documenting of the Ukrainian experience of the current war. And she will talk about methodological and ethical aspects on the ongoing war documentation. And Kateryna Busol is international lawyer and researcher, and she comes from Kiev, Ukraine. She is a senior lecturer at the National University of Kiev Mohyla Academy and also fellow at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southern European Studies. Kateryna has worked on different issues of accountability and transitional justice related to Ukrainian Russian armed conflict for international organizations as well as for Ukrainian NGOs. And her topic will be focused not only on violence and witnesses of war crimes, but also on some ideological aspects of rhetoric of aggressor in this situation. And two participants are joining us online. Emmanuelle Chaze, who is a French journalist who has been reporting on Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine since February 2022. And she is also expert in international humanitarian law. And after the reports, we will have a commentary by Sasha Romantsova, who is also joining us online from Kiev. Sasha is executive director at Civil at the Center for Civil Liberties, and as we know now, also she is also in the team who is Nobel Prize winner of the last year. Today we will focus not only on documentation of war crimes in Ukraine, but also on some ethical, psychological, and personal aspects of this topic, which means, for example, how to communicate with people who are on the occupied territories, how to describe the witnesses in press and for media, how to write and report about that in public and also in reports for internal use. And I'm inviting Anna with a report how many times were you raped? about ethical and methodological challenges on the ongoing war documentation.
Teraz? Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you for this kind introduction, and I think that I will start with a little disclaimer, because the question that features in the title of my presentation was actually never asked in our project. Although the sexual violence was narrated multiple times, and my aim today will be to explain why we are not asking this kind of questions. So I will focus on the questions that we do ask, on who is asking the questions and how, and who our interviewees are and how we take care of them. And finally, I will speak briefly about how we intend to use our testimonies in the future. But first, let me introduce the project. You see the website of the project on the screen. Is just the information. The testimonies are not there, but it's in 3 languages available. So the title is 24th of February 2022, 5 a.m., Testimonies from the War. And the idea of the project came already in March 22, when our colleagues in Lviv, in the Center of Urban History, were hosting the first waves of the internal refugees who came from eastern Ukraine to Lviv, and the premises of the center served as a shelter for many weeks. And at some point, our colleagues noticed that these people simply want to talk about what they have experienced. And that was when the idea was born. And then my institution, which is the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences, was invited to join, and the University of Luxembourg and the University of St. Andrews in the UK. So Poland, Ukraine, Luxembourg, and the UK, these are the countries where we are documenting the life experience of Ukrainians affected by the war, aiming at one collection in the future and more partners. But I will only talk about the Polish part of the project today, which at the moment of my talk numbers 150 interviews, totaling more than 450 hours of recording. We have testimonies of people coming mostly from central and eastern Ukraine, meaning Kharkiv, Dnipro, Kherson, Mariupol, Melitopol, Kyiv, being most often represented, but also we have testimonies from Bucha, we have testimonies from Bordianka, from Irpin, and many other localities. So now I will talk about the methodology, about the questions that we do ask. So our aim is to reconstruct the life experience and not to focus on one single problem, be it Russian crimes or Ukrainian resistance. Nice. But this approach allows us to capture both and many more, of course. So we conduct biographical interviews, which means that we do not start with questions about the war. We ask about the war, we ask about when the war started for you, but we ask also about the personal life, about the life history, about the family history, about everything that might somehow influence the way that this person is experiencing this very war now. And then we, of course, follow with the detailed questionnaire concerning the period immediately before the invasion, the very day of invasion, and the time that followed, before the interviewee left Ukraine. And here we are asking mostly about the changes in the everyday life, which means food, water, energy supplies, healthcare and hygiene, media and information, education and personal life. If a person experienced Russian occupation, then we, of course, ask about the context with the Russian troops, about the behavior, about the crimes. We ask about the attitudes of the local population and everything that is connected with that. And then we ask about leaving Ukraine, because this is the reason why we are talking with these people. They left. So we ask about this decision-making process, why Poland, about the trip, about the border crossing, and about the arriving in Poland. And we are interested about the life in Poland too, which means that we are asking about how people are adjusting to the new living conditions, how they find an apartment, whether they send children to the Polish schools, whether they enter the labor market, how do they make for a living, whether they have good relationships with Polish authorities and Poles or not, and how they maintain the contacts with Ukrainian colleagues and loved ones who stayed in Ukraine. And how we conduct these interviews. As you see, there are many questions to be asked, but the idea behind all these questions is that we follow our interviewees. Some questions are never asked because there's no space or no need to be asked for them, and plenty of others that do not feature in the questionnaire are asked. And this is possible because all our interviewees receive the short list of the questions in advance. Usually we meet twice. First time to explain everything and to give the list of the questions, and then the people come to the interview with already prepared story. And I've conducted hundreds of oral history in my life, and I think this is the first time when I'm really asking very few questions. Sometimes my role is simply limited to asking for minor details, dates, and names. And of course, this way of interviewing is very specific and requires, I would say, specific skills. And now I will talk about my team, which now consists of 12 people. All interviewers have previously conducted interviews that concern this kind of topics, which is war, violence, displacement, loss, humanitarian crisis. And we decided that this project is not a moment to train people how to interview, that we don't want to rely on the volunteers. We search for experienced researchers, for professionals with appropriate experience, and we are paying them for their job because we consider this job a very demanding job. All our interviewers speak fluent Ukrainian or Russian, or most often both, and additionally we have two female Ukrainian refugee scholars in the team, which is meaningful and important. So now a few words about the recruitment. Who are our interviewees? We have prepared detailed criteria specifying who can be involved and who cannot, and thus we are only reaching out people willing to give the testimony and convince somehow that they are ready to do it. We do not persuade people and do not encourage them. And again, this is, I think, the very first time in my life when I'm not persuading people to speak with me for my research. These are all people of age who declare themselves and seem to be, according to our judgment, in a good psychological and emotional condition, which is very important. People who are in a safe position for at least 4 weeks, meaning that they crossed the border at least 4 weeks ago. People whose basic material needs, meaning here the board and the accommodation, have been satisfied. We did not conduct interviews right on the border. We did not conduct the interviews on the railway station and in the shelters, even though there were many possible interviewees available. And finally, we do not conduct interviews with people who are dependent on us, economically, emotionally, or in any other way, which means that I have not conducted any single interview with a friend or a colleague, or people I've helped or hosted. And all these criteria have one aim, and since this project anyway involves what we define as vulnerable population, we want to simply exclude from our sample people who, because of their condition, might be even more vulnerable, people who are not ready to talk, people who are under stress, under pressure, who are in the process of developing clinical PTSD, or who might say yes because they want to please us and not because they want to talk us. We know that limiting our sample this way limits our findings and the scope of the gathered material, but I think that with better mass and fascinating story than harm a person. So make sure you do not harm and only then record. This is the principle that is guiding our research. But it's the general principle, among many detailed principles that are guiding our entire documentation process, and I will now describe some of them. So we conduct only audio, and we interview only in person, no video, because it limits the intimate character of the interview. No Zoom and no Skype, because we need to build an atmosphere of trust for this kind of interview. And besides, if something happens, if this person collapses emotionally, if there is emotional breakdown, we can do nothing if we are online. We can react and assist if we are in the same room. Our interviewees, as I said, receive all information about the project in advance, and they can prepare. They know who we are, they know what we want, what they can expect, and what will happen with their testimony. We conduct the interview in the language chosen by the participant, which means in Russian or in Ukrainian, and also all documentation that we use in the project was prepared in Russian and in Ukrainian. And yet, most of the people coming from Eastern Ukraine choose to speak Ukrainian, sometimes quite poor Ukrainian, and I will be happy to talk about it more during the question and answer session. We conduct the interviews in a safe and comfortable place for the interviewee, which means that sometimes it's her or his apartment, sometimes it's the apartment of the interviewer, sometimes it's a community center, or even a parish. It means that it cannot be a publicly available space when people can interfere. We do not ask questions if we see that they are causing a real emotional discomfort. And here I really mean a real discomfort, because it's obvious that this kind of interviews are emotionally distracting. We are not talking about the weather. So the emotional distress in somehow is part of the interview, but our goal is to, not to make a real emotional discomfort. And this is why I never asked a woman how many times she was raped. We are not prosecutors in that project. We are researchers. And we do not want to re-traumatize people because they were already traumatized once because of what they went through. We follow the narrative, and surprisingly or not, we often receive all the information, all the painful details on names, on all dates. We are also sensitive to sensitive information, which means especially what in social sciences is called the unexpected and incidental finding. And this means data that was revealed unintentionally by a slip of a tongue, or when a person forgets that she is being recorded, which happens during each interview. So when this kind of information appears, we ask the interviewee once again, when the interview is over, whether she really wants to keep it in the recording. And sometimes the person says, no, I forgot that I was being recorded. Please delete this piece. We also provide our interviewees with agency. And I think, in fact, that this is the essential good that we are offering them, the agency. They can decide what to speak about and what not to speak about. And they also can decide how the testimony will be used. We offer various degrees of anonymization, starting with testifying under the real first name and last name, and finishing with deleting from the testimony any single piece of personal information, which means the name of the street and the name of the mother-in-law and the name of the dog, if the person is interested in that kind of anonymization. But usually very few people opt for this form of anonymization. We also mention always the testimony might be used in the future, including the research, the publication, education, exhibition, and artistic purposes. And the fact that this collection will be finally stored in Poland, in Ukraine, and in Luxembourg. And this means that, for example, a person can ask for anonymized use of her testimony in Ukraine, and only for research, but unlimited use in Poland, with no anonymization at all. She can also restrict the access to the testimony for 5 years, 10 years, or, for example, until the war is over. Finally, we don't we don't leave our interviewees alone after the interview is over. We maintain the contact and check whether everything is okay after a couple of days and then after a couple of weeks. And then we are asking again about the anonymization process, about the agreement on what to publish, what not to publish, and so on. Having said that, we are aware that even most carefully prepared project that concerns this kind of experience might cause an emotional distress, and this is a risk that we are acknowledging, and while we make every effort to avoid it, it happens, and when it happens, we do not pretend that we can replace professionals, because we cannot. We are not psychologists, we are not therapists. We can offer attentive listening and we can offer empathy, but when we see that it's not enough, we kind of redirect the interview to the professional, to the psychologist. We cannot offer, of course, the regular therapeutic process, but we do have a Ukrainian psychologist cooperating with us, and her contact details are listed on the information that the person receives. Which means that we are not mediating in the contact. This person does not need to contact us to contact the psychologist, and we are not monitoring these contacts, not to put any stigma on people who need the psychological support. And now I'm coming to the conclusion, how we intend to use the data, or in broader sense, what's the aim of the entire venture. At that point, this project is much more about the documentation and less about research. We are still collecting, preserving, and preparing for the archiving. Currently, we are still in the process of recording, and depending on the funding, we are aiming at 200 or 300 testimonies, totaling, I guess, up to 1,000 hours of recording, hopefully. All our interviews are being transcribed in their original language, which is Russian or Ukrainian or Surzhyk or both, but we do not intend to translate them, which means that for now we are creating a source base and not ready-to-use tool for journalists and educators. The access to this collection will be postponed until we finish the archiving, that's for sure, and until we make final decisions about the archive we want to place our collection in. As of today, the interviews conducted in Poland are destined to be archived in the Archive of Qualitative Data, which is part of the Polish Academy of Sciences, and in the Urban Media Archive in Lviv, when the situation allows to transfer the data to Ukraine, which is not possible now, of course. At the same time, we have applied for a major European grant that might help us to build the archival infrastructure within the Polish, Ukrainian, and Luxembourg team. This does not mean that we intend to keep our collection for ourselves until the infrastructure is built. We believe, and our interviewees also believe, and they express it during the interviews, that the aim of this project is not only to document, but also to somehow bring the message, including to the European countries who tend to forget that there is ongoing war still in Ukraine, right across the border. And thus we have decided to cooperate with the House of European History, that is preparing the exhibition based on our interviews, and we have shot a documentary movie for the Polish public featuring 2 female refugees and 3 researchers. And then the question is, do I have 2 minutes for a story, or the time is over?
If you can.
Yeah, okay. So, because talking about methodology is of course important, but there are stories behind, and I think that I would like to bring you just 2 small stories, 2 insights that give you an impression about what these people talk about. So, and I think that this also justifies somehow our approach. So the first story is of my interviewee from Kyiv, who was born 1941, and I have interviewed him in Kielce in Poland in November. He left Ukraine in March, and when I asked him when the war began for him, he asked me which war. And then I've received 2 hours narrative about the first war he experienced as a child, experienced and remembers from his family history. So there was a talk about the Second World War, there was a talk about the Stalinist time in Ukraine, and then after 2 hours, we reached the actual war, which is taking place now. And he finished his story saying that he's not coming back to Ukraine until the war is over because he already experienced one in his life, and he wants to die in peace and not in war. And the second story, a very short one, is of my interview from Mariupol that I've conducted in June in Warsaw. And that was a middle-aged woman that lived in Mariupol before the war, and she spent 3 weeks with her family, with her mother-in-law, with her husband, and with their 2 cats on the 9th floor of the high-rise building in Mariupol under the siege. During that time, her mother-in-law died because of the lack of medications, and they needed to bury her in the playground. And then the high-rise building was bombarded, and one of the cats burned alive in the building. They managed to survive, and they managed to take this cat through many Ukrainian cities to Warsaw. And she ended her talk saying that the talk during which I asked one question, one opening question, please tell me about yourself and about the war. And that lasted an hour. And she ended this talk saying that, in fact, the Russians only killed her cat directly. But she feels that they are responsible for everything that happened to her city, to her mother-in-law, to her cat, to her neighbors, to her building, and that she will hate them to the end of her life. And that was said in pure Russian, because that was one of the few interviewees that was absolutely unable to speak Ukrainian. So this kind of story is really, I think, powerful because it shows that in this kind of story, you have the crimes, you have the personal experience, and you have also the identity choices that show that language used is also meaningful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. And the Q&A session will be in the very end of this session. And I'm happy to invite Kateryna Busol with a report on the topic when the head of state makes rape jokes, his troops commit rape on the ground, about sexual violence in the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict. And I guess that this presentation is dedicated to the dynamics of the patterns of crimes, but also to the dynamics of aggressor rhetoric, and it is a very important issue. So.
Thank you very much. Oksana, good morning still, everybody, and it was such a great honor to hear about your work, Anna, and how sensitive you are to survivors, because the lack of sensitivity is something I'm going to speak a lot about, unfortunately. But before I turn to discussing the dynamics of sexual violence, I want you to go back essentially a year ago and remember the period of early 2020 when many state leaders went to first Kyiv or Moscow, actually first Moscow and then Kyiv, to try and dissuade President Putin of escalating the war into the full-scale invasion. And after such meeting with President Macron, President Putin and the President of France had a joint press conference in Moscow. And when Vladimir Putin discussed Ukraine's apparent obligation to comply with the Minsk Accords, he used a phrase, «Нравится, не нравится, терпи, моя красавица». And for those who don't speak Russian, I will translate that the words sound as my beauty, it's your duty. And actually, it has been widely referred that those were the lyrics of a song, of a rap song, which was about rape. And we had a head of state who made implicit, or rather I would say express, comparison not just of another country that has to succumb to an unwanted desire, but who, even for their own citizens, so easily joked about unwanted sexual acts. That comes on top of Russia's efforts, mentioned by the colleagues yesterday, to essentially decriminalize domestic violence and to recognize that this is not a problem. We know about the array of the ECHR cases specifically dealing with female victims of domestic violence in Russia. And that also comes as a prelude to a very interesting decree by Vladimir Putin signed in November 2022 about traditional values, which of course endorse the notion of a traditional family, traditional gender roles, and all the threats that the Western world poses to these values. And I just really wanted us to think about the backdrop, about the societal attitude and tolerance in a very gendered Russian society to sexual violence, and how that has reverberated in Ukraine not only after 2022, because it's actually after that that the accounts of sexual violence have become so public and are getting so much attention, but actually that these acts have been there since the very beginning of the armed conflict. My core presentation will consist of three main parts. First, I will discuss the dynamics of the patterns of crimes, specifying how they differed before and after the full-scale invasion. Second, I will discuss Ukraine's domestic efforts to deal with conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV. I'll use this abbreviation, and how much Ukraine has gone and how much it still has to go in terms of the sensitized treatment of victims and witnesses, of which Anna has spoken so insightfully. And finally, I will touch upon the attempts to implement the early reparations for survivors of mass atrocities in Ukraine, and whether these reparations have been gendered enough. So, turning to the first issue of the dynamics of crime, I would like to point out the definition of CRSV, of conflict-related sexual violence, because very often, and the title of my presentation is also misleading in this regard, very often sexual violence is associated only with rape. However, the spectrum of this crime is much wider. It includes forced sterilization, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, forced nudity, threats of rape to a person or to his or her family members, and other acts which involve the victimization or the assault on anything meaning sexual in a particular culture, in a particular society. Another important miscomprehension that has to be addressed now is, of course, that sexual violence, and Ukraine demonstrates that as well, is associated not only with women. Men are affected by it in the same way, but of course with different gender repercussions. And in Ukraine, especially in the earlier years of the armed conflict, when both women and men were subjected to unlawful detention in so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, especially in the notorious former contemporary art center Izolyatsiya, actually, according to the East European Center for Civic Initiative, the Ukrainian human rights NGO that was first proactively documenting sexual violence in the Russia-Ukraine war, every third woman was either a victim or a witness to conflict-related sexual violence, and every fourth man was also either a victim or a witness. So we can see that at the earliest stages of the armed conflict, actually the discrepancy between the male and female victimization was not as big. As regards the patterns of sexual violence between 2014 and 2022, most often it was associated with sexualized torture in places of unlawful detention of people who were supporters of Ukraine, who were deemed to be the supporters of Ukraine, or people who were forced to bargain with Russia and Russia-controlled armed groups in eastern Ukraine. Sexual violence was also noted at checkpoints between crossing the non-government controlled and government controlled areas, and certain instances of sexual violence were also alleged to be committed by the Ukrainian side in the places of detention and also at checkpoints. And here I refer to the findings of the mentioned East European Center for Civic Initiatives, and also to the UN that actually had only one specialized report on conflict-related sexual violence in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, looking at the years of 2014 to 2017. Sexual violence was also employed in Crimea, albeit it has been less reported, because human rights lawyers believe, and I agree with them, with my colleagues, that because it was so hard, and it is still very hard for men to report the sexualized aspects of their torture, and as we know, the persecution, the unlawful detention and sham trials are part of Russia's policy in occupied Crimea, there is a strong belief that the amount of these sexualized measures used during the unlawful detention in Crimea towards Ukrainian and especially Crimean Tatar men is quite higher than reported. At least it's the position of my colleagues from the Helsinki Human Rights Union of Ukraine. Even during the earliest stages, certain hateful rhetorics was already observed. There are accounts of pregnant women held by the DPR and the LPR people, the so-called DPR and LPR, and they testified that when they notified the armed groups and the Russian military who held them that they were already pregnant and they asked for more humane treatment in detention, the phrases were that the world would not lose much if another Ukrop is not born. Similar rhetorics, escalated rhetorics, was reported later on in the earlier days of the full-scale invasion. Indeed, the first case considered domestically in Ukraine of the repeated rape of a woman in the Kiev-Brovary region also concerns hate speech, where she said that when she asked about where her husband was, the two Russian soldiers said that they had killed him because he was a fascist, but them being a fascist does not prevent them from repeatedly raping that woman. So, but what has changed since the 2022? First, both the patterns and the spread of sexual violence. First, the victims started to include also the minor people, also civilian men, and also the elderly people. It was already mentioned today that the UN Commission of Inquiry is documenting also the violations perpetrated after the full-scale invasion, and they have confirmed the victimization of children under 10 to people who were older than 80 years old after the full-scale invasion. Second, if the threats of rape and sexual violence were prevalent in the pre-full-scale invasion period, now sexual violence is often perpetrated by the Russian service people in front of family members. And in my work with survivors, when they said what traumatized them the most in their experience, they actually said that sometimes experiencing the violence themselves was easier for them than to bear the threats that would be perpetrated to their family members and to their daughters. So when we think about what Russia is doing at the moment, when women are perpetrated in front of their husbands or in front of their parents, or the UN Commission of Inquiry has other horrific examples of the sexual assault of children in front of the parents, that also has a strong suppressive and gendered message, not just to a particular individual, but indeed to a family unit and to Ukraine as a national ethnic group. As regards the dimensions of sexual violence that have been noticed after the full-scale invasion, apparently it has also been on a much larger scale, also when women are being kept in particular rooms and being repeatedly raped there. So it's not a sporadic one instance. The amount of hate speech has also escalated, and as far as I have heard it from the representatives of Ukraine's War Crimes Unit, they're trying to connect the physical assault and also the rhetoric that accompanies that assault. Turning to the Ukrainian side and to the domestic proceedings, where does Ukraine stand? It has been mentioned by different colleagues both yesterday and today that Ukraine has indeed activated all possible lawfare measures domestically and internationally, and since the early years of the armed conflict, Ukraine as a state, but also jointly with the human rights organizations, submitted numerous communications on alleged war crimes to the International Criminal Court. And the communications were indeed numerous. They concerned the torture, the unlawful detention, the deportation of Ukrainian prisoners from Crimea to Russia, the policy of changing the demographics of occupied Crimea by bringing the Russian population there. But I ask you to pay attention to the fact that among all this numerous communication on the government side, there hasn't been any communication on sexual violence in the earlier years of the war. As of November 2029, the Office of the Prosecutor General was compiling the first communication to the International Criminal Court on sexual violence. And this fact is indicative at least of two dimensions. First, that this type of crime was not really prioritized by Ukraine's investigators and prosecutors. And second, and perhaps this is a positive side, that because this type of violation is so sensitive, is so re-traumatizing, that the Ukrainian criminal justice sector was essentially taking it very cautiously and trying to make it as victim-sensitive as possible. However, it was not always victim-sensitive, because Anna's presentation was called "How many times were you raped?" and you said that you don't ask these questions. But Ukrainian survivors have testified that, unfortunately, during the criminal proceedings in Ukraine, they sometimes would be asked this direct question, which is in breach with any basic recommendations about working with such deeply traumatized victims and as victims of sexual violence. So currently, Ukraine is really learning on these past mistakes. Ukraine's War Crimes Unit has established a specialized division dealing with sexual violence. The International Protocol for the Documentation and Investigation of Sexual Violence in Conflict has been translated into Ukrainian. So have been the Murat Code of sensitive dealing with survivors, as well as the Hague Principles. So the basis for Ukrainian criminal justice professionals who don't speak English is already there. Second, Ukraine also has committed to diversify its staff, its criminal justice staff, to ensure that more female investigators and prosecutors are available to work on a case if a survivor chooses so. And indeed, in my legal practice, in my experience, even the male survivors oftentimes favor the work with a female investigator and prosecutor if they have been victimized sexually. Second, there has been a targeted outreach to the Ukrainian judiciary and the specialized training of the Ukrainian judiciary on the issues of conflict-related sexual violence. And this is of a crucial importance because, unlike investigators and prosecutors, the judges have not, in the earlier years of the armed conflict, been as much involved on developing their expertise on conflict-related crimes, especially such sensitive ones. And finally, Ukraine has developed, it is still to be made available publicly, but Ukraine has developed a specialized strategy for dealing with victims and witnesses of conflict-related sexual violence to ensure their sensitive and care treatment as much as possible. To conclude, I will turn to my third point about reparations and seeing survivors of sexual violence in conflict as a particular group of people who need particular sensitized reparations within the transitional justice framework. Ukraine has launched its transitional justice thinking in 2019 when President Zelensky said that justice efforts have to be holistic. They should be not just about the courtroom, they should also be about truth-telling, reparations and institutional reforms. And that, of course, meant that victims had to be engaged in these processes to inform the government, essentially, what reparations would be most sensitive and healing for them. And unfortunately, both according to the UN and according to the Venice Commission, Ukraine's efforts so far have not been proactive enough in terms of really reaching out to victims and witnesses and understanding their needs and sensitizing governmental help pursuant to their type of victimization. Global Survivors Fund has done a targeted outreach of a small target group of 20 survivors of sexual violence in Donbas and Crimea to understand their needs, and not surprisingly, their main priorities lay in obtaining sustainable medical, psychological support, couple counseling, assistance with professional requalification, and assistance with obtaining good education for their children upon the relocation, because many of them, either for political reasons or because of the social stigma, could not live anymore in their region of their where they were brought up. And this is still to be taken into account by Ukraine, because since the full-scale invasion, we have noticed again this shift essentially to the narrow accountability understanding of, well, essentially seeking the perpetrators and having them accountable pursuant to a fair process, but in a courtroom. But more discussion should be there about the reparations, not just for the reconstruction of Ukraine, but for the assistance to individual survivors. And to end on the positive note, I will refer us to the resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, adopted actually less than 2 weeks ago, together with this quite groundbreaking resolution of the same Parliamentary Assembly regarding the support for the creation of the Special Aggression Tribunal. It has not received as much attention, but the Parliamentary Assembly has adopted a specialized resolution on conflict-related sexual violence. And although it was of a generalist nature, it did raise certain issues with respect to Ukraine, namely to first support Ukraine's domestic effort in prosecuting this crime sensitively. Second, to support the universal jurisdiction proceedings. They have been mentioned during this conference, but I think not as much, and we should really stress how much the effort of individual states in prosecuting conflict-related crimes related to Russia's aggression are important, and how much they would help Ukraine's criminal justice system, which is succumbing under these thousands of cases. Also, the connection between conflict-related sexual violence and ensuring the prosecution of the crime of aggression has been stressed by the Parliamentary Assembly, because it was noted that it was the crime of aggression that essentially enabled and triggered conflict-related sexual violence. And two final important points was, again, the stress on reparations and transitional justice process in Ukraine, something Ukraine, again, should go back to and go beyond just the criminal accountability. And also the Parliamentary Assembly supported the use and repurposing of frozen assets of Russia to help the survivors, but they spoke about such repurposing not generally, but for the use by the Trust Fund for the Victims of the International Criminal Court. And yet I take it as a positive sign, and rather the guide for both the Ukrainian government and Ukraine's international partner to ensure the sensitized approach to this particularly vulnerable group of women, men, and non-binary persons. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kateryna, for such a deep report. And now Emmanuelle Chaze, French journalist, who is hopefully with us.
I am here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you. Emmanuelle Chaze, as a journalist, was in Kharkiv region, also in Izium, in September 2022, and she reported to the international media about the situation on the occupied territories, and now she prepared a report on the topic war crimes committed in recently liberated Izium, what can be published, which includes also aspects of communication with victims and with families of victims and married people, and about the details which can be published also in local and Ukrainian media, how ethical it is, and how to do it in case if you want to influence the foreign audience, but also to describe the picture of this Ukrainian war crimes and witnesses. Can we start? Moment. Live regime is usually interesting, but
Hello, back.
Hope we hear it.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I wish I could have joined you in person, but I needed to be in Kiev for work, so I'm joining you for this beautiful, still city. As we speak, there's new war crimes that are being committed in Kramatorsk, in Kherson, in Kharkiv. In Kramatorsk last night, 3 people have died, 21 persons were injured following the shelling of a residential building, and in total since yesterday, 7 civilians, 7 Ukrainians died, and 31 were injured in Russian shellings. And attacks on civilians amount to war crimes, and this might be the most and the best documented war in history, but documenting the horrors still doesn't prevent them from happening. They are happening on a daily occurrence and even today. So let's not forget that as we speak, the death toll increases continuously. In September, I was sent on assignment for Germany's international broadcaster Deutsche Welle in the Kharkiv region as it was being liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces. I arrived there on the 13th of September, and I knew immediately that I wanted to go to Izium because back then there was fierce fighting happening in that region. I knew that all that area of Kharkiv region, Izium, Balaklia, Kupiansk, were of paramount importance for Ukraine to regain, as the aggressors' troops were stationed there, and they had huge logistics and transport hubs there. So I knew it was a significant area. Back then, we already knew what to expect in terms of discoveries when territories were liberated. We had already seen, either in person or through the press, the terrible images of Yablonska Street in Bucha, near Kiev, and that after months of occupation, we also got the testimonies of the survivors. We had seen the horrors that unfolded in Mariupol, to name only those 2 cases, because they had huge resonance internationally. So we were under no illusion that we would come across anything different this time around, and after 6 months plus of occupation. Still, nothing prepares you really for the amount of horror that will unfold in front of you. And this is why I wanted to join this panel today in memory of the victims, but also because I recently graduated in international law, and I know even more so now, and I still believe that international law is what should prevail, and that in order for justice to run its course, we have to see a joint effort between authorities, between witnesses, be they civilians or the press, to aggregate those testimonies and the proofs in order to hold accountable those who committed those war crimes. And yesterday, Magdalena Gavin from the Pilecki-Institut said that Russian aggressions throughout their history were characterized by their cruel methods and subsequent impunity. I've witnessed firsthand the consequences left of months of Russian occupation. So I'm bringing this testimony to share with you how I processed what I saw within the frame of my work as a journalist. So I'll walk you through what I saw. I will explain to you how, as journalists, my team and myself handled the tasks, what we decided to publish, and what impact it got internationally. So what we saw. In mid-September, the counteroffensive was still in full-fledged in Kharkiv region, and the extent of the war crimes committed during 6 months plus of occupation were only unfolding. On September 17th, as the existence of the mass graves in Izium had only emerged, we were authorized by the Ukrainian armed forces to go to Izium to report on the case. It was still an active combat zone. When we arrived there, it's roughly 3-4 hours journey from Kharkiv city. Even from the road, you could notice that something abnormal, something out of the ordinary had taken place there in the outskirts of the city. We were in the middle of what looks otherwise like any European forest. There's pine trees, regularly planted, but we could see from the road, even before parking, piles of yellow sand, which looked freshly dug. And back then, the exhumations of the bodies had just started. So we parked at the edge of the forest next to a truck that read Gruzd-200. This is cargo 200. That means the truck is there to collect dead bodies. There were no surprises there. We expected it. We took out the camera. It was the first time on such a site for my camera person, Eugenia. He's Ukrainian, my fixer, Vitaly, who's also Ukrainian. And while I had seen dead bodies at sea during previous reporting in Central Mediterranean, it was also my first time seeing mass graves. As we walked towards the burial places, because there were both mass graves and individual graves, over 440 bodies were uncovered in total, mostly bodies of civilians. We were seeing forensics looking absolutely aghast, absolutely shocked, even if it is their job to handle such situation. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the horror that we witnessed that day. There are things that are untranslatable, indescribable. Yet it is my job to do just that for people who are not on site, even if I see a hellish situation, hell on earth, and that's what I saw that day, I have to find the words. There were so many graves that several diggings and several preliminary autopsies were taking place simultaneously. Bodies exhumated were bearing signs, obvious signs of violent death, torture. Many bodies had their hands tied, others had been shot at close range. I had never seen decomposed bodies, and many of the corpses we saw that day were killed back in March at the very beginning of the occupation. Frankly, I didn't even know where to look because everywhere I set my eyes was a scene of sufferance. So what to film in those circumstances, and how the journalists who were on scene handled what was in front of them? Talking from my own perspective, I wanted to look away for my own sake, but I also knew that I was there to bear witness, not just to film, not just to get a report out of this case, but to witness, to testify, and for inform people, and in my case, mostly out of Ukraine, about the reality of this war, the reality of war crime. It is the highest responsibility one can get as a journalist, and it's also a responsibility towards the victims and their families. So I looked and I wondered, even if myself I'm seeing those things, what can I and what should be seen by other people? I didn't ask myself that so much to protect an audience against terrible images, because personally I think people ought to see what's happening in order to understand. But when filming such scenes, lifeless bodies of people who were once a father, a son, a daughter, a brother, but who suffered a very, very violent death, a terrible death, who were beaten up, tortured, in some cases castrated, you have to keep in mind that this person still deserves the utmost consideration and respect, and not just her or him, but also their relatives, often relatives who at this stage don't know what happened to their loved ones. So it was a no-brainer, for example, to blur the pictures of the corpses, because never would I want to inflict such pain upon a family that through the reporting they might recognize a deceased loved one. Still, It is stepping into the unknown for many colleagues, myself included, and many people on the scene were in a state of utter sideration. There were colleagues that didn't notice that while filming exhumations and preliminary autopsies, they were also stepping on other graves, therefore trespassing on a crime scene. Other colleagues told those off, and some tried to be a bit more mindful, but even forensics were overwhelmed by the scale of what we were uncovering. Around us, there were also some locals. They were looking for their relatives. And that, from a journalistic perspective, needs to be shown, where we cannot just interview someone who's in a state of shock. Of course, this is subjective, but it is a choice I've made not to ask the people on site about their impression, about why they were here. There's another element. As a journalist, your newsroom will want footage, images as soon as possible for publication. And there, not everyone in the newsroom will have the same sensitivity to the topic. It can be because of a limited time. It can be because of a lack of knowledge of the topic. For a specific producer, not everyone that deals with what you are reporting on will be an expert on that. So one important task that needs to be done beyond the reporting, but while you are reporting, is to make sure that even before the footage reaches potential publication stage, that none of what will be published will negatively impact people who are directly affected, as I mentioned before. I'm thinking about the relatives first and foremost. When it comes to bodies of people tortured, it's not about sparing horrible images to the public. It is also about sparing those potential relatives of the victims and prevent that they recognize their loved ones through the pictures. So it's all about not inflicting any further damage on them, not desecrating a grave, not disrespecting a body, just so as to get a good image. It might go without saying, but believe me that in the rush of the publication process, those steps are very easily overlooked sometimes, so they have to be carefully watched. What was published? The exhumation operations were filmed, as well as the preliminary autopsies, the body bags that were lined up, interviews were made on site with volunteers who dug up the bodies and who were willing to talk, and they were telling us how themselves would need years of therapy, maybe for the rest of their lives after going through that. And I'm talking about young people in their 20s, mostly, living in the Kharkiv region and having to dig bodies of people that they strongly relate to. It's important to show those first-hand witnesses and to give them the possibility to speak up as well, when they are willing to do so. On September 17th, to my knowledge, there were no external observers apart from the press. There were no international NGOs witnessing the scenes on that specific day. There was international help for forensics a few days later. For example, France had sent a mobile DNA laboratory on site. It had already been used in Bucha a few months earlier. But that day, on the 17th of September, there were only forensics, war crimes prosecutors, journalists, and a few locals. The first findings were unequivocal. The bodies showed traces of torture, as I mentioned, and even without being a forensic, without being an expert, you could understand it by seeing the hands of some people tied in the back, the broken skulls, blood on the clothes. And in the absence of international institutions, it was paramount to document every single aspect of what we saw. Ukraine at the time was calling for international help, but in view of any equivalent of a possible Nuremberg trial for Russia, we still need independent and external proof in order to build up the case. So we filmed everything, but we didn't publish everything. The bodies were blurred, as I mentioned. I think in one of my reports, you might see a foot and a shoe, but we even blurred the hands tied in the back so as to respect the bodies that were there. But even with blurred areas on screen, you can understand the extent of the horror that was unfolding, and that was what needed to be shown. So what impact does it have when we publish that kind of content? Anyone covering Russia's war against Ukraine will tell you that it exposes them to online abuse, disbelief at best, insults or threats in the worst cases. We don't necessarily have the tools to counter the online abuse, but we do have the tools to spread our reporting for greater good, to spread the knowledge in the hope that it will create enough proofs to follow through with prosecutions. And also enough indignation in the audience for things to change. That's maybe a naive hope, but that's still a hope I have. So on the way back from Izium, in a car where we were all very quiet, with very little phone coverage, because along the front line it's difficult to have a good connection, I published a few pictures, blood pictures and depictions of what I saw on social media. And I wrote, I quote, "I'm just back from the mass grave sites in Izium. It is worse than anything you can imagine. I can confirm that at least part of the people recently buried there were tortured and suffered violent deaths. The remains of 17 Ukrainian soldiers were found there. Their bodies were taken away for autopsies. The remains blood on the picture, one pictures that I posted, are those of an 18-year-old man. His hands were attached in his back. He received a violent blow with a sharp object on his head. His genitals were crushed and his inner thighs bore traces of torture." This was very detailed. I wasn't sure whether my post would be removed because it violated the guidelines, maybe because trolls would be signaling it. I wasn't sure people would care. Because of the lack of coverage, phone coverage, and my own settings on Twitter, I didn't receive any notifications until I came back to a hotel in Kharkiv. And that is when I saw that people had been immensely shocked by what I was telling. And this showed me how essential it is, and it had been that day, to bear witness to the worst. Some, but a minority, came after me to say I was lying, that people had not been tortured, that they had been killed by Ukrainians. They were a minority, and I had seen the proofs of torture of Ukrainian civilians living under occupation. Soon there would be testimonies of locals who would corroborate the fact that they had been killed, that people in the mass graves had been killed by the occupiers. Thousands of people reacted to the publication, and that same evening we edited the report. It was broadcast the following day, and it contributed to Izium being widely in the news for weeks after the uncovering of the mass graves. Very soon, the reports were quoted by colleagues, also on Wikipedia, and it remains available as open source. Did it change the course of things? Of course it didn't. But the footage I got that day, myself and colleagues from other outlets, the testimonies we gathered, they are here, they are open source information, they are available. You can ask any journalists who have been on site, they will be happy to hand in the footage to international institutions. I keep mine as well, and beyond the report, I would like them to serve as proofs when Russia will have to answer for its crimes committing during what I can say are the darkest hour of our history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Emmanuelle. And now we are trying to switch on Sasha Romantsova, who is... Hello, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine. I'm trying to
The sound is not very well.
I'm trying.
Sasha, we are hearing your surrounding, but not you.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Now it is better, but still not very well.
Sorry, it's impossible to find other solution. Just like this. I'm trying to speak louder that you will normally hear me.
So, okay. Sasha Romantsova is currently in Kiev, Ukraine, and she can tell us a bit more about those things which were described in the previous reports. And Sasha, what is doing right now in Kiev? Not in the room where you are, but can you tell us a bit more about your current activities and about your organization, and also We would be happy to hear your comments on the reports.
Center for Civil Liberties documented war crimes and trying to exactly advocacy, different kinds of international mechanism of justice, because all what we are documenting together with our partners from Initiative Tribunal for Putin. We are trying to advocacy for make a final decision, create international tribunal against crime of aggression, and supported work with International Criminal Court about other war crimes, which included crimes, gender-based crimes, and sexual crimes. Sure, for us, it's really important to understand how manage this category of crimes, because from one side, before invasion, Ukraine don't have strong system exactly support survivors of sexual crimes and victims of sexual crimes. So it's need to understand that people now in Ukraine who survive after such kinds of war crimes, they don't have feeling the safety even this territory was deoccupied. So that's why so important our first speakers work with such victims and survivors who left Ukraine and now can be feel more secure and possible to speak about these kind of crimes in different countries which exactly such support propose. So when we document it, that means we go into the field mission. So we speak with people in the occupied villages. We speak with people who left their houses because this territory is still occupied, and situation with the crimes, with attacks, personal attacks and sexual crimes, it's horrible, truly. And biggest problem that people not prepared to speak with that with authorities with whom with prosecutors and investigators, and Kateryna Busol really with the details describe what's the biggest problem. It's manner of speaking with such people, and because Ukraine state still don't have a system of security when we at begin propose people medicine and psychological support, and after this only speak with prosecutors who exactly have knowledges and skills, speak like really carefully speak with survivors. So when we go into villages, and mostly people, it's not those category who openly speak by crimes which was happened with them. Mostly we heard about such cases from other person who know this, his survivors. And biggest problem that first what we can do only be assured that such people have this medicine and psychological support. We recommended our partners like Laskada and other NGOs who have such skills and such systems. But never we do that. We do that by myself. I mean, documented testimony these victims. Why so? Because our documenters are not prepared to speak with such person from one side, from other side. Oh, it will be emotionally too difficult for them. So that's why we are our main policy that with such hard category of documenting, we trying to connect them with people who first of all can support them. As for me, it will be biggest number of cases which we will hold after victory, maybe after 5 and 10 years, like that happened after the Second World War, when waves of knowledge about such crimes will be open after victory happened. when people more feel security, and when people exactly will see that justice is happening. Because really, it's emotionally really hard for people now, not like don't see that exactly court is happened, perpetrator sitting in the court like an accused. So biggest question which still people put our field missions at the occupied villages, when Putin will sit in the bank of accusation. So I think that possibility to speak with such people, that people will open their stories only when they will feel security, when they will saw examples of justice against these perpetrators and aggressors, and when they will feel comfortable and supportively manners of negotiation, of exact communication between them and prosecutors system. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you for joining us in such hard surrounding. And I'm inviting Anna and Kateryna also to come back to the stage. And please switch on Emmanuelle also. And now it's time for Q&A session. And before that, I want to inform all of you that in 5-10 minutes we'll have also a press conference in the hall of the Institute with journalists and participants who want to attend it can go directly to the lobby. And questions? Several.
Hello, I have a question to Mrs. Kateryna Busol. I'm not a profi, but I have the feeling that this systematic rape and weaponization of rape by military servicemen, especially raping women in front of the family or children in front of the family, this method of humiliating population, intimidation, Europe have seen in last years already in Yugoslavian war. And we know that war criminals were judged in Hague before the International Criminal Court. So do you think that this experience, this law experience from Yugoslavian war could be helpful for you in future in order to prosecute war criminals from Ukraine?
Thank you very much. Indeed, it was during the trials at the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that the real investigative and prosecutorial strategies for looking into rape, and then the International Criminal Court developed other types of sexual violence, were really developed. And currently the court is also working at looking at the crime of gendered persecution. So I think international law is moving in the right direction. And unfortunately, I would agree with you that Ukraine has many facts for such investigations and prosecutions. My hope would be just not only for The Hague, my hope would be that the International Criminal Court takes some emblematic cases which are not only horrific in fact, but which are also very strong with evidence of linking these facts as high up in the Russian military and civilian political command as possible, first, but also that Ukrainian justice system develop the capacity of dealing with these crimes and with dealing with these victims in a caring manner. And as I mentioned, that countries that have opened the universal jurisdiction proceedings into the Ukrainian situation, that they also do this, because the survivors that I have personally interviewed favor still proceedings in other states. I think there's still this a little bit of a prejudice that they have to overcome in terms of, communication with the investigators in Ukraine, first. And second, there's so many survivors who are now in Europe that pursuing this universal jurisdiction proceedings, and we are currently in Germany, the country that has acted so well on, the horrific crimes perpetrated to the Yazidis, for instance, or to the Syrian survivors. So I think there is a hope that the sexual violence in Ukraine's armed conflict will get the focus not only in The Hague, but also across the universal jurisdiction proceedings countries. Thank you.
Thank you. And we had one more question.
Thank you for your amazing presentations. And I would have one question to anyone who would like to answer. Because you mentioned that there are standards on interviewing victims, survivors. One of them is Murad Code. We have a lot of soft law standards. There is no hard law on that, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. So I would like to ask, what is your opinion, whether, first of all, the standards that are developed there are enough? Because I heard that Murad Code is still in development. It's a preliminary version. And what would be the, let's say, next level? What would be required for this code to be final? Whether there are some missing parts for the protection of the victims, and whether you think that the availability and dissemination of that kind of standards is enough, because you mentioned, and we could hear that yesterday, we also heard about another database of testimonies, and I heard that there is a difference in methodology. So I would like just to ask, because there are so many Syrian archives, now Ukrainian archives, many archives worldwide on the same subject, and I would like to ask your opinion whether there is a cooperation between those centers, research groups that are doing that, just like opinion more than facts.
Who can answer?
Okay, I will start. I think you raised principally two questions. First, the sensitized interviewing, and second, the issue of over-documentation and the issue of harmonizing the documentation efforts, which is part of being kind to survivors and sensitive to survivors. As regards the Murad Code, actually the updated version has recently, I think like a month or 2 months ago, been published. So it's, you just might want to check it up. And I just think that actually in terms of what I have seen in Ukraine, I think these two instruments, the Hague Principles, the Murad Code, and the International Protocol on the investigation, documentation and investigation would be enough as the great starting point. So I wouldn't also overburden Ukrainian professionals. And here I'm speaking not only about the criminal justice systems, but also, myself, you know, the practicing human rights lawyers or academics or journalists or, you know, people who engage with survivors. It's guiding for everybody, not just investigators and prosecutors. And yes, indeed, we are witnessing Ukraine's armed conflict with Russia live. It's arguably the most documented armed conflict in the current history, for better and for worse. Because survivors, and this has been repeated by many colleagues of mine, they notice that survivors want to speak less and less. I witnessed family disputes when the husbands would tell the wife, like, why did you start this? Why did you open up the story? Now we have this visits, it was an investigator, now this human rights lawyer, then we have a journalist. So there should be more alignment, first, of the strategy, why cases are documented. It's important not just to show the thousands of registered proceedings, but to have essentially, for instance, one uniting case, for instance, of attack on civilians in the Kharkiv area, and then see how the dots are connected, not to break up the cases, and of course to try and to align the governmental, the civil society, scholarly and journalistic effort as much as possible, because the databases not only are different, but the outreach is always, you know, separated, and the over-interviewing is really re-traumatizing, particularly for the victims of torture or rape or similar grave crimes. Thank you.
I think that I won't add anything to to what you just told, because I'm not. It's just not my field. This formal regulations that concern the prosecutors and the professionals, but I can, I think, elaborate a little bit about the general methodology and what happened in Poland since March. And I will start with saying that I think it's obvious that we, in our project, are doing many things differently than colleagues from the Lemkin Center, but the reason is that our aim is different. I mean, we are not focusing on the immediate crimes documentation. We are reconstructing the life experience that also touches the crimes, but not only. And the difference is also in who is conducting the project. We are an academic institution. In fact, we were ready with our methodology in March, but then our project underwent a double ethical committee review that took 2 months. And we've received, like, I don't remember how many pages of recommendations from first our internal ethical committee from the Polish Academy of Sciences, and from the external experts. So it took time to develop all these standards. And I think that the difference between the NGO activity and the public institution as the Lemkin Center activity and an academic project is in standards that we need to obey. So this is just about different standards, also formal standards. And I think that, well, in Poland, it was obvious in spring that at some point everybody wanted to document, to do something. But it was also obvious that we are lacking the methodology. I mean, that we cannot enter the field with the methodology that we had from interviewing of the Holocaust survivors, or from the interviewing, I don't know, the general life stories that we used to conduct before. So we needed time, and we needed to work on the standards. And I don't really believe we need one single unique standards that can be used by all projects. What we need is the space where we can discuss our methodology. And in general, I think that it needs to be discussed. We need to pay attention to the way we conduct our projects. We don't need to agree on every single detail of the methodology because we have different aims, but we need to be sensitive and attentive.
I'm going to use my power as technician in the back to ask one question to Emmanuelle, because she has to go really soon. Do you remember the case of Ed Vuliemy, who was one of the journalists who discovered concentration camps in Bosnia and then later testified in front of the court and was highly criticized by his colleagues? And the question is, are you ready to testify? And what do you think about this kind of action, since you said that you bear responsibility as a journalist to be the... you bear this responsibility.
I do remember that case. It's something, of course, that I ask myself daily when I report on such cases. I don't think it infringes upon my work if I testify on something I have seen, so I would be ready to testify. There's something that I haven't told you during my presentation, but last year I had registered to a postgraduate degree in international humanitarian law, and most of my studying happened in bunkers because I spent most of a big part of my year in Ukraine, in various parts of the country. And I can tell you that when you are sleep deprived, you are studying in a bunker about international law while constantly being reminded above your head that it's not being respected, it puts in perspective a lot of things, a lot of beliefs you previously had. I doubted that international law was at all still relevant, to be honest. And when I went to my exams, I had some oral exams and I had very interesting discussions with my professors. I graduated, but I questioned my role as a journalist. Of course, you should always, as a representative of the press, be neutral in your reporting, but let's not fool ourselves into thinking that we don't have feelings, that that we are not touched as human beings by the things we see. And for me, it is a responsibility to report fairly, to report neutrally, but my responsibility, this is a personal choice, will not stop just there. If I'm being asked to testify on what I've seen in Izium or elsewhere, I stand ready to do so. I stand also ready to hand in any personal footage that I have filmed on that day.
Thank you, Emmanuelle.
Yes, so thank you for this presentation. So I would have two questions. So one question to Anna. So you mentioned that you did previous projects in oral history, and my question is, so what was surprise for you? So in this particular project, so apart from this dimension, emotional dimension and trauma-related dimension, because I assume that you took it for granted that such a dimension in this particular project related to the war, there is taken for granted. But what was surprise for you? So what you didn't expect it while you're starting this oral history interviews? And the second question, so probably to Emmanuelle, so or maybe to all of you. So because this particular war is probably the most widely covered by media, and we have many different various information. And also thanks to Emmanuelle, also thanks to such projects as these projects, oral history projects with the refugees. So do you think, is it really so that this assumption or this assessment that this war is something new because this information, this kind of information is a challenge for us? So the very fact that we know, I don't know, so not enough or maybe too much about this, too much in order to assess this war, or I don't know. So because I think from the general view of for example, of science of history is that for example, the people who dealing with medieval times, so they use one document, and on the ground of this document, they interpret the history, what happened. But now, so the historians of for example, of the 20th century had another problem, so that they too many information, too much to be assessed, too much to be interpreted. And I think, so this is a challenge for us, and I'm curious, what is your assessment on that, of the very fact that you provide so many information, so much, and what we will do, or do we manage to interpret, to collect this information?
Thank you. It is really nice when all the people who asked me to stop discussion right at 1 p.m., including organizers and staff, prolong the discussion. And I'm sure that our event is really successful. And can we answer probably shortly, because participants need a break, but it's really important to talk about that.
I can quickly answer on the amount of information. I don't think it's too much. I think it's definitely a very well documented conflict. It's also important to remember that there are such conflicts happened before, and we talked a lot about the plight that the Syrian population is under, and now we talk a lot less about it, but they are still being bombed. And they're not in the news anymore. It doesn't mean the information is not there. It means that we are not looking at it right now. Right now, there's a huge focus on Ukraine, and this is something that has to be positively seen for the future for the intent of prosecuting war crimes, for example. I was mentioning Mariupol. There was an investigation a few months after the bombing of Mariupol theater by my AP colleagues, who took months in order to recreate what happened during that bombing. There is never too much information. They used every single bit of information they could. That can be mobile data, that can be drone pictures, that can be testimonies of survivors. Some people will not talk to you right after the event because they are too traumatized, and they will open up a few months later. And all that aggregate of testimonies will allow be it researchers, be it journalists, being judges, prosecutors, will allow people to do the necessary work to bring, to hold people accountable. So yes, right now we are overwhelmed by the mass of information, but it is also something that helps the international community, the legal community, to process what is happening. There's a lot of misinformation, but this too has to be debunked, so I don't think it is problematic to have that much information. And 80 years ago, maybe some entities could get away with the fact that they didn't know, and yet this is arguable. Nowadays, we simply cannot turn a blind eye anymore. This is happening in a place that everybody looks at. It was still happening. It was also happening a few years ago in other places that got less traction than Ukraine is getting now. But we have to use it positively we have to use it positively to try and document and to eventually prosecute those crimes.
Thank you. And Anna?
Yeah, shortly. I know that everybody's looking for the lunch. So just shortly, I think that the main difference between all the oral history projects that I was involved before and that one is the time dimension. I mean, this is the first time we are documenting the ongoing crisis and the war that is still ongoing, and this difference is really creating the challenges for the interviewees and for the interviewers, because I think that while we were expecting that we will need to take care emotionally of our interviewees, we didn't expect that we are going to need the support, and we do. So I needed to organize a supervision for our team, and even only after that it started to work. And I think that what surprised me most in this project, that these people really came with a story. I mean, we have this questionnaire, we are asking questions, but I mean, so many interviews when the first question was asked after an hour or after 2 hours. Because for us, this is documentation, this is a research project. We are all researchers and we have somewhere behind the research questions. But for these people, this is a testifying procedure. They come to testify and they bring the story, and they are so much convinced that it matters. And I think that this is most surprising in that project.